I want to ask you what it is like for the men and women working at the department to see one of their leaders, Jack Smith, targeted and threatened by Donald Trump and his allies. And I'm sure you and I have both been attacked over Twitter by the twice indicted, twice impeached ex-president. And I think there's something that people don't understand, that your family worries. And there is a destabilizing nature to being targeted by the leader of that movement, leader of the right, a party that doesn't quickly condone violence, that doesn't quickly condone anti-Semitism, that doesn't quickly condone racism. There is something, again, this is where the right is onto a set of tools that more closely approximate an autocrat's toolbox or something even darker than that. But I wonder if you can talk to me, as someone who led the department, about what is available to them or how they are at this moment, this unprecedented moment where they've charged an ex-president and they seem to be on the precipice of charging him again.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that, has to have an impact on people within the department. I mean, these are strong folks, and, they're used to being criticized. But the level of criticism that you see here, the unfounded levels of criticism that you see here, are really kind of unprecedented. And so that's why, as I said earlier, I hope that those people who are right-minded will come to the defense of the people in the Bureau, the defense of people at the Justice Department, and understand that these personal attacks on Jack Smith and other people, I remember when, after the court-authorized search of the Mar-a-Lago residence, the names and the addresses of the agent who actually conducted that search were publicized. And shortly thereafter, a person decided to attack the FBI office in Cincinnati. So there are real-world consequences for this. And you put people's lives at risk for no good reason. Now, people who sign up to work for the FBI understand that they're putting their lives at risk, and they can, face all kinds of life and death situations, but not these kinds of life and death situations that are perpetrated by people who are former government officials generally, and formulated by people or by a person who was the former president of the United States. This is something, again, unprecedented, something that we should not accept, and something that we have to push back against.
I wonder if we could, while we have the privilege of your time, dive into some of what we understand to be in focus in these final days of what may be the investigation into Trump's role in trying to overturn his defeat. Let me start with some of what Trump was actually saying. I mean, the thing about Trump, and we saw this in Jack Smith's last indictment, he uses his own words against him. He quoted Trump talking about the importance of how you handle classified documents in that indictment. So we rounded up some sound about Trump clearly trying to disenfranchise voters in some of the country's largest cities. Let me play that for you.
We were winning in all the key locations by a lot, actually. And then our numbers started miraculously getting whittled away in secret.
What changed this year was the Democrat Party's relentless push to print and mail out tens of millions of ballots sent to unknown recipients with virtually no safeguards of any kind.
They have these lock boxes, and they'd pick them up and they'd disappear for 2 days. People would say, "Where's that box?" Over 8,000 ballots in Pennsylvania were cast by people whose names and dates of birth match individuals who died in 2020 and prior to the election. Think of that. Dead people. Lots of dead people, thousands.
Now, of course, none of that was true. Donald Trump's own election security advisor, Chris Krebs, described it as, quote, the most secure election in America's history. But when you read that Jack Smith is considered charging Trump under Section 241 of Title 18 of the U.S. State Code, which makes it a crime for people to conspire to injure, oppress, threaten, or intimidate any person in the free exercise or enjoyment of any right or privilege secured to him by the Constitution or laws of the United States. What do you think of making a case like that against Trump?
Yeah, that statute has been interpreted during the course of the 20th century, meaning that a person's vote should be counted, that a person should have their vote counted in a way that it was intended, that you shouldn't do things that would have a negative impact on the validity of an election, ballot stuffing, a whole variety of things. And so I think, yeah, that statute is applicable here, given what we understand from the media, those around Trump attempting to do. I mean, when he calls down to Georgia and says, find me, I guess it was 11,780 votes, whatever the number was, that was clearly an attempt to do something other than that which was consistent with the facts. And so that, I think, is cognizable under that statute, in addition to other things that that he has done. As I said, the statute itself, by its language, you might say, well, is that something that really applies here? But if you look at the long line of cases, I guess the last major one, I think, was written by Thurgood Marshall, that really talks about making sure that a vote actually counts, that strength of a vote is not diluted, that elections, in essence, are fair. And what was attempted by the former president and those around him was to conduct an election that was anything but fair. And I think that using that statute makes a great deal of sense.
And do you think that charging him under that statute, and should he go on trial for that, it seems that is in some ways the greatest parallel to what the January 6th Select Committee was able to illustrate, which was through Trump supporting Republicans who acknowledged Trump's attempts to co-opt them, thinking of Rusty Bowers in Arizona. There was a coast-to-coast plot to overturn an election defeat for the first time in history.
Yeah, it's the same thing as I was saying before about stuffing a ballot box with votes that were never actually cast. And that has certainly been recognized as something that comes under Section 241. This was just a different form of ballot stuffing, to find votes that were never there and to have them counted, to take fake electors and to try to swear them in as representative of a particular state. There's a whole range of things that was done by the Trump campaign, by the people in the Trump orbit, that were inconsistent with our laws and inconsistent, most specifically, with that statute.
Can you deepen our ability to understand what might have gone on at the department? There's a lot of analysis that, but for the dramatic and rather spectacular, meticulous nature of the congressional investigation, which was public in nature. The depositions were all taped, so when they put them together, we could see them. Cassidy Hutchinson's live testimony was riveting. It was last minute, and it seemed to catch even the department that you once led, the Department of Justice, by surprise. What is your sense of what happened there and why all news reporting suggests that they were late to turn their focus on Trump's role in the criminal aspect of January 6th?
Yeah, I think the Justice Department was a little late in ramping up its investigation, the inquiry with regard to those people at the top of this whole conspiracy. They've done and continue to do a great job with regard to the foot soldiers who were there on January the 6th. And I remember early on hearing people say, well, this is going to be a typical investigation. We'll start from the bottom and we'll work our way to the top. And I was thinking, boy, there's a lot of people that you're going to have to get through in order to figure out what's going on at the top. And my initial thought was you probably want to run these things in parallel. All right, the foot soldiers are there. We'll try to identify them. We'll hold them responsible. But then who put those people in place? Who encouraged those people to come to Washington on January the 6th? And what is all of that about? And so having a parallel investigation going at the same time, I think, would have made sense. Now, having said that, I think that with Jack Smith's appointment and the speed with which he has apparently been moving, I think the Justice Department has gotten back on track. Though there was lost, some time that now puts this potential investigation or this ongoing investigation, right in the middle of or close to an electoral determination that the American people have to make as to who the next president of the United States is going to be, and who Republicans have to decide is going to be their nominee. That, I think, is one of the negative consequences for that for that delay. I think, as I said, the Justice Department is operating quite well now. But that pause really has had an impact, or is going to have an impact in some form or fashion on our politics.